Hello, everybody. It's me, Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. However, most African and the other non-white races lived in small breeze block houses built for them by the Department of Housing from an allocation of the national budget set aside from white taxpayers' money, and for which they paid a nominal amount of rent. In the rural and homeland areas, Africans were allowed to live in their traditional fashion in mud huts, managing as subsistence farmers by keeping cattle and goats and planting enough mealies and sorghum to be able to survive. Work as farm labourers was very much in demand because, although the wages were low, white farmers set aside areas of their farms for their Zulu labourers, where the head of the family could build a couple of huts for himself and his immediate family, and his wives and children could earn a little bit of money by hoeing fire breaks, weeding crops, or herding stock. They were also then able to grow mealies and vegetables on the small areas around their huts and keep a cow or two, or even sheep and pigs. Surplus milk from the farmers' herds was freely available to them. They also received fairly substantial rations in the form of coffee, sugar, mealie meal, and meat. Our own farm staff grew plump and healthy on a never-ending supply of surplus food, retaining their whole salaries to take home and educate their children. As South Africa became more and more developed and industrialized under the nationalist government, work that paid a good living wage was available mostly in towns and cities, and people decided to relocate there, often with their families, to be able to live better lives. So the Zulu family and tribal infrastructure began to break down. It isn't really a family in the Western sense of the word. A Zulu kraal is a cluster of huts built around a well-swept patch of bare ground where the family, or more accurately, tribe, lives. The chief, or induna, of the tribe has his own hut, and his mother, wives, and children another couple of separate huts. Father was still alive. He'd sleep in a smaller hut by himself. In most cases, the men, often including the chief of African tribes, chose to leave home to work as labourers in the gold, diamond or coal mines, far away in the cities. Grandmothers and mothers would be left to look after sometimes as many as 12 children or more, ranging in age from infants to teenagers, while their sons and daughters lived and worked near the cities and sent most of their wages home. The people who worked in the towns and cities chose to live in squalor, cheek by jowl in shacks in squatter camps or overcrowded locations. In some cases, the women would wake at about 4 in the morning to light their cooking fires. They had to buy their firewood, which was collected by other women who lived further out and had access to trees and forests or plantations. And girls, some as young as 7, could collect only fallen wattle and gum branches. Didn't have permission to actually cut any timber, as it was all either state-owned, planted and harvested by quasi-government organizations in the pulp and paper industry, or gum trees which were used as pit props in the mine, which were privately owned. It was a common sight to see these women and girls who'd been to teza, means to collect firewood, walking along the side of the road with long bundles of wood that they'd gleaned, tied up with hand-woven ropes. Their burdens, which would always contain branches several meters long, would be balanced on their heads on a little round pad of cloth. Invariably, the women had an infant tied to their backs with a shawl and were followed single file by several other children of varying ages, the smaller girls carrying small bundles of kindling on their own small heads, and often with smaller siblings on their own backs. If they had to cross a road, it was with enormous difficulty. As they turned their heads to look left and right for traffic, the long bundles swung slowly and precariously from side to side as well, and then they would clutch their bundles to their heads as they ran across the road. They'd walk for miles with great dignity, dwarfed by their massive loads, backs ramrods straight and heads held high. Further each time as the available timber was harvested. It never occurred to anybody to plant a tree. Even a gum tree will grow to decent firewood within a couple of years, but they don't plant. Once back in the location, they'd use their firewood or sell it to buy food. Coal was expensive, even though it was mined locally, and enterprising Africans could collect what fell off passing trains or trucks and bag it, load it onto ramshackle carts pulled by 1 or 2 sorry-looking donkeys, and sell it to the women living in the townships. Paraffin was used in stoves, but it too cost a lot of money and had to be bought from local general dealers, mainly Indian, who bought it in bulk in 44-gallon drums, decanted it into 5-litre cans of 1-litre bottles, or 1-litre bottles, and sold them individually at a high markup. Women brought these containers and carried them home on their heads, bought these containers and carried them home on their heads, as they did with everything else. Any labour which paid well lured all the able-bodied men away from home to live in purpose-built hostels on the mines or near factories in the industrial outskirts of cities. Big concrete blocks of cells in the middle of a barren piece of ground and surrounded by razor wire. These places were built specifically to house male workers and resembled prisons more than workers' accommodation, In spite of adequate sanitation and food, these strictly men-only hostels rapidly became disease-ridden dens of vice, such as prostitution and drugs, where dealers and pimps alike profited. Boredom and frustration were fueled by hard liquor, easily obtainable from shebeens, illegal undercover drinking dens, where unscrupulous women often brewed their own horrific version of a moonshine alcohol known as shimeon, which had additions such as battery acid to pep it up and could be lethal to those who had been accustomed to drinking nothing stronger than amacheo or sorghum beer. Many deaths were attributed to the consumption of shimeon. Fights broke out over women or between factions, different tribes of Africans, or most commonly between Zulus and Xhosas. Often those fights were to the death, and the authorities called the police to intervene if it looked as if this violence would spill out of the hostels and compounds into the mines or factories themselves, and possibly endangering valuable property. All the police were well armed with assault rifles and heavy caliber sidearms like 9mm pistols, and used them to good effect. They would shoot to kill, and as a result, the faction fights were quickly quelled and the bodies taken away to the SAP mortuaries to be identified and their next of kin located, if possible. Their families' addresses could be as vague as Shack 745, Area 5, Umlazi. Umlazi is a massive African township sprawling for miles outside Durban, the full extent of which, like Soweto, near Johannesburg, can only be seen from the air. Whenever I flew from Durban to Johannesburg, it was always a shock to me to see how far the townships and squatter camps stretched away into the distance, and sometimes even beyond the horizon, knowing that each tiny speck of a hovel housed so many people. Only whites were allowed to vote in elections, so not even the Indians or coloured people had any voice. The press was strictly controlled by the nationalist government, and there was no freedom of speech, rather the reverse. If any white journalist dared to print news criticizing the lifestyle of the majority of the people, he could be jailed for subversion or treason. Stirring up unrest was the term the police used. Worse treatment befell journalists who persisted after being warned off by the authorities. If they tried to reveal just how dreadful the situation really was for blacks, a branch of the police force called the Special Branch would deliver letter bombs, which in one case blew the hands of the daughter of a journalist. Another reporter who'd spoken out against the nationalist government had a bomb planted under his car during the night. His family was killed when his wife started the ignition the following morning to take their children to school. This even affected our family. My father's first cousin, Peter Brown, wrote a fairly innocuous letter to the Natal Witness describing or mildly criticizing the government for its policies. He was put under house arrest for 10 years. And then, when he was let out again after a week, he was put back into under house arrest for another 10 years. So for 20 years, he couldn't watch his children go. He couldn't go and watch either. He had twins, a boy and a girl. These were cousins of ours. The girl was at school with me, and the boy was at Michael House. And only my Aunt Phoebe was allowed to visit. And Vanessa, my cousin, was in the first tennis team. And I used to sit with Phoebe as she sat on her own to watch Vanessa play. And this went on for 20 years. If we ever visited Peter and Phoebe and the twins, only two of us could be dropped off and Mum would have to leave because more than 6 people constituted as a gathering, an unlawful gathering. So it had to be carefully planned who stayed and who went. And it was just very difficult, particularly for Phoebe. 20 years under house arrest for one mild criticism of the government in a local rag. It was attacks like these carried out all over the country during those 46 years that drove journalists underground or forced them into exile. From the safeties of countries like Britain, they could continue to draw world attention to the alleged horrors of apartheid, encouraging other nations to impose trade sanctions or oil embargoes. Even international sports bodies suspended interaction between themselves and South Africa, much to the dismay of we whites, especially the Afrikaners, who are excellent rugby and cricket players. These measures didn't seem to have much effect on our government, though, because the Nats held on to power for well over 40 years and only gradually began to relinquish their hold over the population, both black and white, when even the most dyed-in-the-wool Afrikaner nationalists could see that they couldn't suppress the blacks for much longer before there was a proper revolution and a bloodbath. That's it for today. I didn't want this to be a political book, far from it. But I had to put this in for my readers who were not, who knew very little about South Africa, as to what the actual truth was about apartheid, and in retrospect, how really well it worked for everybody. They were all black, white, Indian, coloured. Well, not white, not so much Indians, not so much coloureds, but the Africans certainly did not, or nobody thrived from black rule, to be honest. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Thank you too to John Oslane, who's my sound engineer. And I'll see you again next week. Goodbye. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.